Hello, my name is Eric Hahn, and welcome to Shit I Have to Teach in 20 Minutes, a podcast for history teachers and anyone who wants a quick dose of history. And this will be our third episode. I have an announcement that it is going to be my colleague Rob Good's birthday coming up. He is so old. When he went to school, he didn't have history classes. There just wasn't any history to discuss. At any rate, we appreciate all of our listeners so far. Thanks very much. In each episode, Rob and I interview an historian about their scholarship, asking them to identify the most important concepts they think teachers should share with their students about the topic for the day. We also include a free lesson plan that can be downloaded from the episode notes linked to the podcast. Rob, what is our topic for today?
Today, we're going to explore how to teach the American West. It's one of those topics where students enter the classroom with lots of ideas as a result of popular culture. Eric, you're so old. I think you listened to the Lone Ranger on the railroad or on the radio. On the railroad. You were actually in Texas listening to Lone Ranger speak. And today's students are watching like Taylor Sheridan's Yellowstone, 1923, 1883, I think is what it is. And that may bring some questionable ideas about the history of the American West into the classroom. And so our guest today, we are lucky to have Lindsay Stallones Marshall join us for this discussion. Lindsay is an assistant professor of history at Illinois State University. She also taught high school. This is really important. She taught high school for over a decade in California, and she is a professor who truly grasps the realities the classroom teachers experience. Her understanding of the education informed her first book, Teaching Us to Forget: The Wars of Western Expansion, U.S. History Education and Public Memory, 1970 to 1995. And Lindsay consistently champions and advocates for K-12 teachers and is the co-chair of the Committee on Teaching and Public Education and for the Western History Association. She has made sure that teachers are both recognized and supported. And one of the ways that that organization, the Western History Association, champions and supports teachers is they provide 4 $1,000 scholarships for lesson plans, or $1,000 awards for lesson plans written about the American West. And they are recognized every year at their annual conference. This year, the competition is closed. But please, we will put a link in the episode notes, and you can find out about that there.
Yes, please apply.
Yeah, gotcha. Lindsay, thanks for joining us today. Our big question that we love to ask historians is, what advice would you give teachers regarding how to approach teaching the complex topic of the American West?
It's like the worst question, but in a good way, in a really good way. I was trying to boil it down to 3 things, because when I was teaching, I had about space in my lesson plan for 3 things, right? That I would go to these seminars. And I decided, rather than say, okay, make sure you hit these, topics, I wanted to talk about 3 ways to frame history of the U.S. West, because I found it was trying to teach the history of the U.S. West that actually pushed me out of the high school classroom. I began to realize over the years, as I tried to learn more, that I didn't really believe the way that we frame it in K-12 anymore. And so I had to go to grad school to figure out what I thought. I don't recommend that, leaving the stable, not great paying, but steadily paying teaching job to try your hand at the roulette wheel of academia. But I'm happy it worked, for me at least. So the very first thing I think that's really important to understand about the U.S. West is that it is fundamentally a story of invasion and continued occupation. This is not new. Scholars have been talking about this since at least the 1960s, and some scholars were talking about it long before that. But we have so mythologized the West in our culture, both in our formal histories. I mean, David McCullough's book, The Pioneers, came out, 2 years ago, which still is this kind of triumphant westward manifest destiny narrative. It's like the zombie vision that just won't die of the history of this region. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And that's my point too. But point 1, it's fundamentally a story of invasion and occupation. And one of the reasons why it is so persistent is because it fits in with a way that our narratives of the entire story of the United States are broken. This country was founded through invasion from Europe, and it was founded in sovereign native space. But the way we teach history is that Native American history is a minor thread in the larger story of the United States. Chronologically, the opposite is true. Native history hasn't ended. The United States thread is happening within the much larger thread of Native history. But when we flip that context, the only role that Native people play in the story of the West is obstacles to westward expansion. And in fact, enemies to American progress. So that's the very first thing to keep in mind is when we teach this story, there is a lot going on. It's complex, it's fascinating. There's a technological aspect to the history and an ecological aspect to the history. There's a lot of race and gender and really exciting stuff that goes on in the West. But it was all built on the foundation of the violation of Native sovereignty and the persistence of that violation, I guess would be the best way to say that. So that's the first thing that I would want to keep in mind.
Can I ask a question around that?
Of course.
Well, I just did. I asked a question about asking a question. In that invasion and occupation narrative, which I think it permeates through, right? And this may be a point that you're going to bring up in a bit, Native resistance to that and the fact that the power that Native and Indigenous people had to be the decision makers. You know, I'm sitting here in St. Louis, and really St. Louis only exists because the Osage said, okay, yeah, you can settle here, because they had the power to push them out. So that may be another point. But so in talking about invasion and resistance, invasion and occupation, is resistance linked to that?
Resistance and resilience. It's really easy to fall off kind of the other side of the horse. Instead of only teaching, triumphal U.S. westward expansion, you teach just degradation and, the vanishing Native, kind of the D. Brown, bury my heart at Wounded Knee version of history. And that is also inaccurate. As I said, U.S. history is still occurring inside the timeline of Native history. Native nations, despite the best efforts of one of the more powerful militaries of its time, were not erased, were not eradicated, triumphantly existed beyond that and continue to do so. So that's as equally important as understanding the reality of what the settlers tried to do, is understand the reality of how Native people refused to be erased.
How is that concept of Native sovereignty, how is that defined? Does it differ in any way in the way we might define the United States today as a sovereign nation?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question because the U.S. has tried to contain Native sovereignty since the 1820s, and long before then, but just through the courts since the 1820s. So the official legal designation that federal law recognizes is that Native nations are domestic dependent nations, which is a delightfully vague term that can mean whatever the person with the power to exert authority wants it to mean. But that also means that it has a lot of negotiable space within it, which is how Native nations have persisted despite a full onslaught. So Native sovereignty, we can think about it in terms of cultural sovereignty. We can think about it in terms of literal legal sovereignty. And also we can break those categories down when we think about like the protection of indigenous foodways that we see with people like Sean Sherman in the Twin Cities, promoting indigenous chefs and promoting the protection of wetlands where, rice is grown and things like that. Like these are all pieces of the exerted sovereignty of Native nations.
Well, did we stomp on your other two frames or
Not at all. No, you're leading beautifully into them. It's wonderful.
Good. It's all by design. We've been up all night planning.
Yes, we did. We coordinated. The second way I would, if I was going to go back and teach this again in the high school classroom, the second thing I would make sure that I framed was that the way we talk about the West, especially in terms of the frontier, has been carefully constructed over a very long time. We can trace it back, the book that I am finishing up right now traces it to the wars against Native nations in the late 1800s, which are kind of the flashpoint. A lot of things were unsettled about what America was until the end of the Civil War. And then kind of all that attention turned west to invade the West, and almost as a redemption from the violence of the Civil War and the schism of secession and the traumas of Reconstruction, right? And we think about the West as this place of boundless opportunity, open wilderness, where we can start anew. There's a lot of that dialogue in the late 1800s. I just saw that there's a TV show, a reality show, where families are going to go, quote, back to the frontier. And one of the families, when interviewed about why they wanted to do this, they talked about their kids being on their phones too much, and they wanted them to like build character. And that is so deeply ingrained in our psyche as a country. And that's not an accident. That was a carefully constructed myth that has its roots before the Civil War in the original colonial expansion. I mean, we can't forget that one of the main arguments for the American Revolution was that the British forbade expansion beyond the Proclamation Line for 1763, which is basically the Appalachian Mountains. And so the notion of a frontier, which we inherited from like James Fenimore Cooper and all that stuff, really blows up in the late 19th century. There's a return to it and a recrafting of American identity around the frontier. So when you talk about the West in your classroom, you really want to make students aware that the way we think about frontiers is very specifically constructed both to create a new identity for the country, but also to justify the violence. And it was, even for its time, abnormally brutal violence that was required for settlers to invade native lands past the Rockies and places like that. So that's something I would keep in mind as well.
Yeah. That's you're so enthusiastic about the topic.
Yes.
I'm curious, about any possibilities of the structure that was set up for the United States, whether or not there were people who were advocating for any kind of native rights or coexistence of that sort. Are there any examples of that teachers might be able to bring up in the classroom?
I mean, the first thing that I wish I had known when I was teaching is that the Indian Removal Act only passed by a handful of votes, fewer than 10. Yeah. There was immense opposition to that plan. And that plan rewrote the relationship between the United States government and Native nations. So if you look earlier in the history, particularly when the balance of power is not necessarily clear to the United States in terms of their ability to assert military dominance in particular regions as the country was moving west. Just keeping in mind that none of this was inevitable, and that a whole lot of people who were not Native went into Native spaces for centuries, and rather than remake those spaces in their image, they joined Native worlds. And so that possibility was there. But early on, I mean, as early as Jefferson's writing a letter to, I forget which general, where the very first appearance of the phrase Empire of Liberty is in his instructions for how to subjugate a tribal nation. So the idea that the US would assert its dominance is very, very early. But also the idea that we could enter this Native world as relatives instead of as conquerors was equally asserted in this time, just not necessarily by the power brokers.
That's a hopeful, it's like balancing that with invasion and resistance, construction of this frontier to justify violence. And people are like, no, let's not, let's have a different construction. So a third frame. Wow. So I'm just thinking of the teachers are like, okay. But right. But I think these things, they knit together beautifully. Yeah.
And before I get to the third frame, I would mention what you said, I think is one of the more important things we can do in the classroom is to point out to students that things are not inevitable, but also that we have examples of people pushing against what seems to be inevitable. So Silas Soule publicly objects to the violence at Wounded Knee and gets in trouble for it. This kind of, we have examples of this from all of these episodes of violence. And it's important to remember that. So the third frame, I would say, is understanding the place that that the frontier plays in our curriculum, and especially in history curriculum. History curriculum is the last to kind of innovate, particularly this narrative, because this narrative is so useful to what we want to teach students. And that's a lot of what my book is about. But the third frame I would say is that the history of the West is immensely diverse. It's not just the story of white pioneers in covered wagons. There are so many people remaking their identity, seeking their identity, and just as often as we find new opportunity in the West, because the further away you get from these centers of power, the less they can exert their power against you. So Black Americans find new opportunities, women find new opportunities, immigrant groups find new opportunities. But it also comes at a cost, because as we expand our culture, we bring our culture with us. And so those same prejudices and the racism and the violence that existed back east gets carried with us into the West as well. And some people find their opportunity through participating in that violence against other groups. And so, rather than looking for kind of heroes and villains, which was what I was kind of trying to do as a teacher, like give cautionary tales and exemplifiers that I want students to, be inspired by, helping students understand that people are messy in every time, and that we can learn from that messiness, I think, is incredibly important. And that also, it's a cliche for a reason. Our liberation is bound up in each other's liberation, and we see that very clearly in the West.
Wow, that's a great way to bring it home. I mean, those three frameworks, our liberation is tied with each other's liberations, and the West is a place where we can see that reflected and opening up those narratives.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So we do want to thank you, Lindsay.
of course.
We're hoping maybe you can return. Thank you, listeners, for listening to this episode. Remember, you can download your free lesson from the link provided in the episode notes. Be sure to stay tuned after this brief song to hear a description of those lessons.
Oh no, the clock is ticking, 20 minutes, time is spinning, falling facts from thin air, hope to think I came prepared.
So Eric, I have to admit, I made a historical error. When Lindsay mentioned that how tight the House vote was on the Indian Removal Act, I smugly claimed that it was 2 votes. Actually, it was 4. That's the kind of thing that my students would have pointed out to me and been happy about that. So speaking about the Indian Removal Act, your lesson focuses on it, doesn't it?
It does focus on the Indian Removal Act. I do want to point out your error, though. Listeners are calling in left and right. They're telling us that the vote was very close. It was 4 votes, not 2. You said 2. Lindsay correctly said it was less than 10, also very close. But the fact that the vote was so close was interesting to me. I don't think I actually knew it was that close. I was inspired by Lindsay's comment about how close the vote was to pass the Indian Removal Act in the context of her talk about how to teach about the West. I finally understand why, after reading this, the proposed bill, and can't believe that in all my years of teaching, I never came across that bill that was proposed to Congress for passage. It presents the issue of citizens living in states or territories and the clash with Native peoples there. The legislators seemingly felt like they were doing the Native populations a favor by passing this bill in its final form. Students, I think, will quickly realize how one-sided that exchange in quotes, because that's what it says in the bill, wasn't really an exchange for the land, how one-sided that really was, and how little protection explicitly was offered to the Indians affected by this act. Rob?
I love that. It's that deep dive into one document. Of course, when we taught AP US history together, it was in the curriculum. How come you didn't come into my classroom and watch? It's all so. Although I wouldn't listen to me either.
Not
yeah.
about AP.
Well, my lesson tries to tie together the 3 frameworks that Lindsay shared. It's a salon lesson. So let me explain a little bit about what a salon lesson is, or how I used it. I used to do this 2 or 3 times a year with my freshman US history class, but it can work at any level. I would explain to the students that a salon is a gathering of people under the roof of an inspiring host. Of course, that would be me as the teacher, or you as the teacher if you do this lesson. And the purpose is to partly amuse one another and partly to increase the knowledge of the participants through conversation. This particular salon is built around the question, should we view the West primarily as a source of democracy or as a location of conquest? The question addresses both Lindsay's emphasis on conquest and her idea that the West is a constructed place, or our understanding of the West has been constructed by people like Frederick Jackson Turner, who argued that it was a wellspring of American democratic culture, and she raised that as a questionable framework. I've also created a list of 30 different historical characters that students can research to come to the salon as, and they will evaluate how that person might have responded to the central question. With the list of characters, I tried to incorporate Lindsay's observation about the diversity of the people in the West. There are men and women from different racial and ethnic groups with multiple perspectives on life in the West. And during the salon, students mingle with each other. They share what they know about their person and their perspective on the central question. And of course, they drink juice boxes and have snacks because it's a very fancy event.
It is fancy. Yeah. Thanks to Lindsay Stallones Marshall once again. Great lesson, Rob. Thank you, listeners, for listening. And remember, you can download your free lesson from the link provided in the episode notes. And please be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts and on Instagram and YouTube.
And you can reach us for any feedback, questions, or suggestions you might have about the conversation or lessons at historyin20@gmail.com. That's historyin20 all spelled out. We'd love to hear from you, and thank you for joining us today.